When I first moved into Sycamore Glen, I thought I had finally found peace. After 22 years in the Army, 12 of them deployed, I'd learned to recognize threats. But nothing about this place with its winding sidewalks, trimmed azaleas, and cheerful dog walkers felt remotely dangerous. It was the kind of suburb you see in insurance commercials, a place where mailboxes match porches, host rocking chairs, and sprinklers hiss rhythmically every morning. I'd retired earlier that year and decided it was time to slow down. My wife had passed away 2 years before, and our daughter was off to college. I didn't want a mansion or a downtown condo, just a quiet house with enough yard for the garden she always wanted. Sycamore Glen checked every box: clean, safe, friendly, or so it seemed. The realtor had mentioned the HOA in passing. They're very attentive, she'd said, eyes darting before pasting on a smile. I didn't think much of it. I'd dealt with worse than lawn inspectors, and besides, I had no intention of breaking rules. I just wanted to live. The first few weeks were uneventful. I kept to myself, spent mornings setting up the garden beds and afternoons tinkering with the little workshop I'd built in the garage. Most neighbors waved politely, though some gave tight-lipped smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. I chalked it up to suburban reserve. No one wants to be the first to knock on a stranger's door. Then came the first letter. It was folded neatly in a plain white envelope tucked under my doormat. The Sycamore Glen Community Association emblem was printed at the top in gold foil. Elegant, official, unsettling. Dear Mr. Granger, it began, formality. Always felt like the first swing of a gavel. Your trash bins were visible from the street for approximately 23 minutes, beyond the permitted window, 7:00 a.m., 7:00 p.m. Please ensure compliance moving forward to avoid administrative fines. I chuckled at first. 23 minutes, someone had to be watching with a stopwatch. Still, I moved the bins exactly on time after that. Then came the second letter: lawn height exceeds acceptable standard of 2.5 inches. The third wind chime exceeds volume guidelines after 8 p.m. I hadn't realized there were volume guidelines for wind chimes. That's when I started paying attention. The community wasn't just watched, it was monitored, observed, measured. It wasn't long before I met Karen. She knocked on my door at precisely 9:03 a.m. on a Wednesday. She introduced herself as vice president of the Sycamore Glen HOA, though she delivered it with the intonation of a small-town mayor. She wore a pastel cardigan and carried a clipboard like it was a badge. I just wanted to welcome you personally, she said, eyes scanning the porch, and gently remind you that garden flags require HOA approval. Yours, she gestured to the little flag in my flower bed. A faded American flag with my daughter's college emblem below it wasn't submitted through the appropriate form. I wanted to ask if she'd served, if she knew what that flag meant to me, but instead I nodded. I'll look into the forms. She didn't smile, just made a note on her clipboard. That weekend I decided I needed air, a different kind of view. I pulled out my drone. It was nothing fancy, just a mid-range quadcopter I'd picked up during lockdown to pass time. I liked flying it above trees, watching the sunrise from angles only birds used to see. It calmed me in a way few things did. A kind of quiet recon. I made sure to keep it above my property and outside people's backyards. I wasn't some creep. I just liked the perspective. But the moment I launched it from my backyard, I felt that shift, like a tremor in the air. Curtains twitched. A phone lifted in someone's living room window. And then 24 minutes later, she was back. Karen stood at the edge of my lawn like she'd been waiting for the drone to land. Her arms were crossed, eyes squinting at the machine in my hand, like I was holding a weapon. You didn't get permission to fly that, she said flatly. I didn't know I needed it, I replied, surprised, but calm. I stayed within FAA guidelines. Never over people. Never below 50 feet outside my lot. This is private airspace, she insisted. I raised an eyebrow. You mean my backyard? This entire subdivision is managed airspace under HOA jurisdiction, she snapped, though I could tell she didn't fully understand what she was saying. She was bluffing, quoting words she hoped sounded legal. I said nothing, just smiled and walked inside. The next morning I found another envelope. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten in all caps. Drones are dangerous. Report filed. Expect consequences. No signature, no return address. They weren't even pretending to be formal now. I didn't know then how far they'd go. That this simple piece of plastic with propellers would become the eye that exposed their rot. that Karen and the board she led like a private militia had something to hide. All I knew was that something smelled off in Sycamore Glen, and for once, it wasn't the neighbor's overwatered lawn. After that morning with the anonymous note, I decided to be more deliberate with my drone use, but not to stop entirely. I hadn't done anything wrong, and I wasn't about to let suburban intimidation dictate how I spent my days. I'd spent my life in environments far more hostile than HOA neighborhoods, and I didn't survive Afghanistan just to be bullied by a pastel-clad woman with a clipboard. Still, I kept the drone grounded for a week. I focused on yard work, finishing my wife's rose trellis, and repairing a few rotted boards on the back deck. But every time I walked past my workbench, where the drone rested, a part of me bristled. I wasn't just annoyed, I was offended. That toy had become a symbol, and I wasn't about to surrender it without reason. Then came Saturday. The morning was warm, cloudless, and still. Birds chirped across rooftops, sprinklers ticked in synchronized arcs, and the scent of freshly mowed grass hung in the air like a welcome banner. I had just come back from the farmer's market and stood on my back deck sipping coffee when the thought returned, fly it. Just a short flight. I grabbed the remote, checked the battery, and launched. The drone rose smoothly silent, save for the light whir of the blades. I steered it upward, hovering above the pine trees at the rear of my property, then nudged it forward to catch a glimpse of the lake that bordered the far end of the community. I stayed well above the rooftops, never dipping below tree line. It was peaceful for about 5 minutes. Then I saw her. Karen, in her driveway, on the phone. She stood with one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, tracking the movement of the drone with hawk-like intensity. Even from that distance, I could feel her glare like heat off pavement. Her other hand gestured wildly as she spoke into the phone, her mouth moving in short bursts like a typewriter. I brought the drone back immediately, landing it softly on the grass. Not even 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of my house. I opened the door before the officer even had time to knock. His name tag read Rodriguez, and his expression told me this wasn't his first call involving neighborhood drama. "Morning," he said politely. "Got a complaint from your HOA about possible drone surveillance." I gestured for him to come around back, and we stepped onto the deck. "You're welcome to look. The drone's right here. I was flying over my property, nothing else." He nodded, examining the drone, but clearly unimpressed with the urgency of the call. "Karen Wright." I smirked. "That obvious?" He chuckled. "She calls us once a week. Last month, she tried to file a complaint because a kid's lemonade stand was non-commercially licensed." I barked out a laugh. "That sounds about right." Rodriguez scribbled something in a small notepad, but made no move to issue a citation. "Look, as far as I'm concerned, you're in the clear. Just stay above 50 feet. Don't hover over people's yards, and you're golden. FAA rules beat HOA guidelines." "Appreciate it," I said, grateful for the rare appearance of common sense in this sea of overregulation. But Karen was watching from her driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed. Her eyes locked on us, as if daring me to smirk in her direction. I didn't. Not yet. That night, I reviewed the flight footage, not out of paranoia, but habit. Years of military training had hardwired me to verify everything. I'd never saved my drone videos before, but something about today's interaction told me I should start. As I scrubbed through the footage, something odd caught my attention. Just past the tree line behind the community clubhouse, a section obscured from street view, I noticed movement. A group of people, tables, lights. It looked like a setup, a gathering. The footage was grainy due to distance, but there were clearly at least a dozen adults in that grove. That wasn't supposed to be public space. I zoomed in. Coolers, folding chairs, at least one barbecue smoker, and a few parked golf carts lined in a row. I frowned. The HOA had always been strict about gatherings, especially unregistered ones. In fact, 2 weeks earlier, they'd issued a community-wide memo banning all unauthorized congregations due to liability exposure. Yet here they were on what appeared to be HOA-managed green space, having a private party behind the trees shielded from sight. And from the looks of it, they didn't want to be seen. I saved the footage on 3 separate devices. Old habits die hard. One copy on a flash drive in my desk drawer, another on my encrypted cloud, and one on a spare SD card tucked inside a labeled envelope, HOA, backup. I didn't plan to use it, not yet. But the next morning, I found my mailbox hanging open, its hinges broken. No package stolen, just violated. Just a message. Then I noticed a sticky note taped to the front porch light. We're watching too. No signature, again. That was the moment it shifted. This wasn't just about a drone anymore. This was about intimidation, control, power. I made a choice right then. I wouldn't be scared. Not by Karen, not by her cronies, not by a hollow threat scribbled in block letters. They wanted silence. They were going to get the opposite. 2 days passed. I didn't fly the drone. Not out of fear, but because I was watching, observing who came and went from that patch of woods behind the clubhouse. From my second-story office window, I had a clear angle, and each evening around dusk, I saw flickers of movement, figures dragging coolers, pulling tarps, and once even stringing up party lights low along the fence line. I started recording with my old Nikon and a long lens I'd used back when my daughter played softball. It wasn't high-tech, but it caught enough faces, license plates, movement. One night, I even recognized Karen's husband hauling in a keg, his face red and glistening as he shoved it onto a wheeled cart. But on Wednesday morning, something changed. It was just past 10 a.m. I was out front planting rosemary when I saw the cruiser again. Not Rodriguez this time. This officer had a squared jaw, dark sunglasses, and moved with the impatient energy of someone who didn't want to be here. He parked diagonally across my driveway, blocking half the entrance. I wiped my hands on my jeans and approached. "You Granger?" he asked without preamble. "I am." "You with Sycamore County PD?" He tapped his badge. "Officer Hale. I'm here on behalf of the HOA. They filed a formal complaint." I narrowed my eyes. For what? Unlicensed aerial surveillance, invasion of privacy, and possible data collection on private citizens. I blinked. "You're kidding." He didn't smile. "I need you to come inside with me and show me the drone in question." I kept my voice even. "Do you have a warrant?" His lips twitched. "Not yet, but I'm trying to keep this friendly." I tilted my head. "Then maybe don't start with a list of made-up charges." Hale exhaled, irritated. "Sir, this community's HOA is asserting that you're using your drone to spy on neighbors. They claim you've been hovering over backyards, capturing footage without consent. That's a serious allegation." I crossed my arms. "I'm well within FAA guidelines. I've never flown below 50 feet over someone else's property. I can show you every flight log, every video. And your colleague, Officer Rodriguez, already reviewed this drone last week and said there was no cause for concern." That made him pause. "Rodriguez," he repeated. I nodded. "Yes, check your system." He filed a report on Saturday morning. No violations found. He reached for the radio, clipped to his shoulder, and turned slightly away, murmuring into it. I waited. After a few moments, he turned back, his tone cooler now. "Okay, I see that. But the HOA says they have new footage showing your drone violating airspace." I raised an eyebrow. "Footage they haven't shared with me or you." He hesitated. I continued. "Because I'd be very interested to see how they obtained that footage, unless they're illegally tracking me, which would make this a very different conversation." Hale stiffened. "We're not here to debate HOA policy. But you are here based on their word alone," I said. "No evidence. No probable cause. Just their accusations." He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably and looked back at his cruiser. That's when I noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk across the street. She was wearing a powder blue blouse and holding a thermos like it was a trophy. Her eyes locked onto mine, smug satisfaction radiating from her face. Behind her, a few other HOA loyalists had gathered, 2 of them board members I recognized from the last community meeting, where they'd spent 40 minutes debating mailbox paint shades. I stepped closer to Hale and lowered my voice. "Look," I said, "I respect law enforcement. I always have. But I'm not some punk kid with a spy drone. I'm a retired Army major with a spotless record and a lot of time to document harassment. This," I gestured toward the small crowd across the street, "isn't about safety. It's about power, control." And the moment they realized I wouldn't bow to their nonsense, they escalated. He studied me. "You say you have flight logs." "I do. I also have time-stamped footage and backups of every flight. You're welcome to come in and review them. But unless you have a warrant, I'm not surrendering private property on HOA hearsay." Hale chewed on that for a moment before finally nodding. "I'll file it as a civil dispute for now," he said. "But if they press further, you may have to speak with the city attorney." I shrugged. "Happy to. In fact, I've already made a few calls." He didn't ask to elaborate. just turned and walked back to his cruiser, casting a quick glance at the watching group before pulling away. Karen's face had changed. The smugness had slipped just slightly. I walked back inside and closed the door quietly. My hands were shaking not from fear but from fury. The gall of it, the performance, the way she weaponized local law enforcement like it was another tool in her suburban arsenal. I sat down at my desk and opened the hard drive. It was time to do more than collect evidence. It was time to prepare for battle. I typed up a formal complaint to the city ombudsman, attaching screen captures and linking flight logs. I included Officer Rodriguez's prior report and described the pattern of behavior, the letters, the threats, the mailbox, the note, and now this false police report's designed to intimidate. I CC'd the mayor's office, the city legal team, and just for good measure, a reporter I knew from a military nonprofit I'd supported years ago. Her name was Dana Lewin. She owed me a favor. The email ended with one line. If the HOA is going to accuse me of spying, maybe we should all take a closer look at what they've been hiding. Then I hit send. Outside, Karen was still watching. The following Sunday morning, I flew the drone again. Not out of defiance, though, I admit there was a sliver of satisfaction, but out of curiosity. After everything that had happened with Officer Hale and the HOA's increasingly aggressive tactics, I needed answers. And more importantly, I needed proof. Because even though I had footage of the mysterious gathering behind the clubhouse, I hadn't yet caught them in the act. What I had were shadows, gestures, traces of movement that could be easily dismissed as circumstantial. So I waited for the perfect day, bright enough to catch details, quiet enough to avoid detection, and launched. I took it higher this time, at an angle where the sunlight wouldn't glare against the lens. I swept past my own backyard and over the green belt, moving slowly and deliberately, staying above tree line until I reached the area just beyond the clubhouse. And there it was, in full view. A sprawling setup hidden in the woods, pop-up tents, coolers, folding tables covered with food trays, a sound system powered by a gas generator humming under a camo tarp. There were at least 20 people, maybe more, some of them sitting with drinks in hand, others laughing, dancing, even taking photos with their phones. And right there in the center of it all was Karen. She stood like a hostess in a country club lounge, flanked by board members wearing a flowing sundress and holding a glass of something pink and bubbly. Her laugh was big and careless, her posture relaxed. She didn't look like the woman who'd spent the last month patrolling flower beds and screaming about community standards. She looked free, unburdened, above it all. But what struck me most was what sat off to the side, a small table with a metal cash box and a clipboard. People were lining up to sign something, forms, maybe a sign-in sheet, and they were handing over money. Dues. It clicked. This wasn't just a party. This was a paid event, held on HOA land. Private, unregistered, unauthorized. That clipboard had the names. The cash box had the trail. And I had them on camera. I circled the drone, slowly capturing every angle, careful not to spook them. At one point, Karen turned toward the trees and shielded her eyes as if sensing something, but the drone stayed high and quiet. After 10 minutes, I pulled it back. No need to linger. Back in my office, I offloaded the footage and backed it up 3 times, just like before. I scrubbed through the video frame by frame, pausing on each face, zooming in on the clipboard, noting the timestamps. I had them. They could deny it all they wanted, but this wasn't hearsay or speculation. It was high-definition evidence of misuse of community land, of likely embezzlement, of selective rule enforcement. They had fined residents for holding birthday parties in their driveways. They had banned block potlucks for safety reasons. But they had no issue running a private cash event in a secluded grove away from the neighborhood's eyes. And they thought no one would notice. But I had. The next day, I printed out freeze frames and dropped them into a manila envelope marked "To whom it may concern." I walked it down to the city code enforcement office myself because when it comes to HOA misconduct, email alone never moves things fast enough. The woman at the front desk raised an eyebrow when she saw the contents. "These are from today," she asked. "Yesterday," I corrected. "You'll see timestamps on each printout. GPS data's embedded in the originals too. You'll want to have someone from zoning and tax compliance take a look. That area they're using, it's Greenbelt owned by the HOA and designated for public use, not private functions. And if they're charging for access, she nodded slowly. Then it's a zoning violation. Maybe a few other things. I'd start with misuse of HOA dues, I said casually. Especially if they bought that sound system with association funds. She looked up. Are you a lawyer? No, I said. Just a retired Army major with a drone and a working printer. I left her with a USB drive and my contact number. That night, I heard rustling outside. At first, I thought it might be raccoons or one of the neighborhood cats that liked to perch on my trash bins. But when I peeked through the window, I saw two silhouettes by the side gate, one holding a flashlight, the other fiddling with the latch. I turned on the floodlights, and they scattered like cockroaches. I couldn't get a good look at their faces, but one of them was wearing a Sycamore Glen HOA windbreaker. I recognized the logo. My security camera caught them running, and I saved that too. This time, I didn't bother calling the police. Instead, I sent the footage directly to the city investigator handling my complaint. I attached it with the following note. They're escalating. I believe evidence is being targeted for destruction. Please advise on protective filing. The reply came less than an hour later. Noted. Do not delete any digital assets. An inquiry is being opened. You will be contacted for a statement. That was the first official acknowledgement that I wasn't imagining any of this. That this wasn't petty paranoia or neighborly disagreements. This was real. HOA Karen had crossed a line. She had overplayed her hand. And now, the people who could really hold her accountable were starting to pay attention. The first letter arrived 2 days later. Unlike the others typed formal signed by the HOA secretary, this one was different. No return address, no HOA letterhead. Just a plain white envelope slipped under my front door like a message from some cheap spy film. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No salutation, no punctuation, no attempt at civility. We know what you're doing. You're trespassing. You're violating community trust. Stop now or pay. That was it. Block caps, bolded words, and a faint smudge of what looked like barbecue sauce in the corner. Real professional. I held it for a while before slipping it into a folder I had labeled Document Everything. That folder was getting thicker by the day. What struck me wasn't just the desperation of it. It was the fear beneath the threat. Someone was sweating. Someone knew the walls were starting to close in. And instead of correcting course, they were lashing out. The next day, the fines started. An envelope from the HOA arrived in my mailbox, this one official printed on Sycamore Glen Community Association stationery, signed and stamped. Inside a notice of violation. You are being fined $250 for unauthorized aerial surveillance and disturbance of common space usage during HOA hours of operation. The accusation was absurd. There was no clause in the bylaws that barred drones. And there certainly was no line about HOA hours for open sky. But the document went further. It cited Section 4.7 of the Sycamore Glen CCRs, a vague reference to behavior that could be perceived as threatening, disruptive, or in violation of community cohesion. That kind of clause is the HOA's favorite tool language, so broad it can mean anything they want. That same afternoon, another fine arrived. $150 for inappropriate signage. I stood in front of my garage for 5 minutes trying to figure out what they meant, until I realized it was the small decal I'd placed on my mailbox a week ago. It was military green, only 2 inches wide, with the phrase, "We the People," printed in block text. Apparently, patriotism was now inappropriate signage. 2 days later, a third fine. $500 for failure to comply with HOA communication requests. I hadn't responded to an email from Karen demanding a meeting. She'd sent it at 11:02 p.m. on a Friday and expected a reply by sunrise. When I didn't answer, it was branded as non-compliance. They were trying to drown me in paper cuts, make me look like the problem, force me into a corner. I didn't bite. Instead, I made copies of every letter, highlighted every absurd clause, and attached them all to an email addressed to both the city's HOA Oversight Committee and the private legal defense nonprofit I'd quietly contacted the week before. Then I did something that would really get their attention. I flew the drone again, but this time, I didn't fly it toward the woods. I flew it straight up 90 feet in the air, then hovered it directly above my own property. No movement, no sweeps, just a quiet still camera aimed down. And I waited. Sure enough, Karen showed up less than 30 minutes later, marching up my driveway like a woman on a mission, her face tight, her phone already raised and recording. She didn't knock. She shouted, "You're breaking the rules again, Mr. Granger. This is harassment. I stepped onto the porch calm. The drone is hovering directly above my property, well within FAA guidelines. I haven't moved it an inch in over 20 minutes. She was shaking, not from fear, from fury. This is a neighborhood, not a war zone, she hissed. Then stop acting like you're commanding a battalion. Her lips curled. You think you're clever. You think the city's going to help you. You have no idea how many friends we have. Real friends. Judges. Commissioners. You're making a mistake. There it was. The mask slipping. The unspoken truth exposed. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about privacy or decorum or harmony. It was about power. Karen wasn't just enforcing policy. She was enforcing control. And the idea that someone might push back, that terrified her. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The drone was recording everything. She stormed off moments later, and the very next day, I got a letter from her, personally typed this time, with her full name and title at the bottom. Mr. Granger, your continued attempts to undermine the Sycamore Glen HOA have been documented and escalated. Any further actions on your part may result in legal proceedings, public censure, and loss of community privileges. This is your final warning. I scanned it, saved it, and forwarded it to Dana Lewin, the journalist I'd contacted earlier. Starting to get juicy, she replied. Then let's meet. I agreed. The following morning, I met Dana at a cafe just outside the city limits. She arrived in jeans and a faded bomber jacket, her eyes sharp and curious. I did some digging, she said after we exchanged greetings. Your HOA president, Karen Mendel, her name's come up before. 3 other neighborhoods, all with dissolved boards or corruption complaints. I raised an eyebrow. No kidding. And get this, she continued, pulling out a thin folder. One of the board members at Sycamore Glen owns a catering company. The same company that's been issuing invoices to the HOA for event services, even though there haven't been any public events in months. My stomach turned. So the money's moving. She nodded. And I've got emails, whistleblowers. A former treasurer who tried to report it and was pushed out. Can we go public? Soon, I just need more visuals. A smoking gun. I smiled slowly. I've got something better than smoke, I said. I've got a whole damn fire. A few days after my meeting with Dana, the HOA board called an emergency community safety review. Flyers were taped to mailboxes and slid under doors with language designed to sound civic-minded but ominous. Due to recent concerns about unauthorized technology use, property disturbances, and community surveillance, the HOA will be revisiting security policies. Residents are strongly encouraged to attend. The flyer didn't mention me by name, but it didn't have to. By then, everyone in Sycamore Glen knew who the message was about. I attended anyway. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative unchecked. I shaved, wore my army dress polo, and arrived 5 minutes early with a folder tucked under my arm containing all my evidence, flight logs, FAA printouts, city correspondence, and a summary of fines I'd received. The clubhouse was packed. They hadn't held a meeting that full in months. The room buzzed with murmurs and tight smiles. Some neighbors avoided my eyes. A few nodded discreetly. But most sat in anxious silence, waiting for the circus to begin. Karen stood at the front of the room in a peach blazer, her hair sprayed into place like lacquered armor. Beside her were 2 other board members, Marty, who once fined a veteran for having a flagpole 2 inches too tall, and Cheryl, the treasurer, who hadn't cracked a smile since the Reagan administration. Thank you all for coming. Karen began, her voice smooth and loud. We've recently received reports, troubling reports about residents using drones in ways that compromise the safety and privacy of our community. She let the words hang in the air, waiting for a reaction. A few people glanced toward me. She continued, we take these matters very seriously. That's why the board will be voting today on an emergency amendment to the HOA bylaws that will prohibit the use of all unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, within the airspace of Sycamore Glen unless expressly permitted by the board. A wave of silence spread across the room. One woman coughed. Another whispered something to her husband. Karen went on, carefully neutral. This is not a punishment. This is a protection. We must preserve the dignity, the privacy, and the safety of our neighborhood. I stood, every head turned toward me. Point of order, I said. The HOA has no legal jurisdiction over airspace. The FAA governs that. Karen's smile was razor thin. Mr. Granger, please. I'm speaking under Robert's rules, which this board supposedly follows. I cut in. I have a right to respond. She relented with a bitter nod. I held up a copy of my drone's registration. FAA certified, registered, and flown within guidelines. Not once have I breached another person's property line. Not once have I flown under 50 feet above non-owned structures. Everything I've recorded is from legal airspace and in public view. I paused. What Karen doesn't want you to know is that my drone accidentally captured footage of a secret HOA gathering, one that used association land and funds without notifying the community. Murmurs spread. I dropped a packet of printed stills on the table nearest to me. Barbecues, cash payments, sign-in sheets, alcohol. All conducted on HOA Greenbelt land without a single permit filed. And do you know who's in the center of it? I pointed to the photo. Karen Mendel. She stiffened. That's slander. No, I said. It's time-stamped video. And it's already been submitted to city enforcement, a journalist, and the HOA Oversight Committee. She moved to pivot, tried to control the moment. Regardless, this emergency amendment is about forward-looking safety. The board will vote now. But I didn't sit down. Before you vote, I said, just know this amendment would violate multiple FAA protections and would never hold up in court. And if passed, it will open this board to litigation. I've already filed a preemptive complaint with the city. You pass this tonight, you'll be the ones breaking the law. It worked. The room shifted. People who had been quiet began murmuring more openly now. A man from the third row raised his hand. If the footage is real, we deserve to know. Another woman added, is this why our dues increased? Karen looked cornered. This meeting is adjourned. But she had already lost control. She hurried out with her clipboard, her two cronies close behind. Several residents remained leafing through the photos I'd printed, muttering under their breath. I left shortly after. But I wasn't done. That night, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. They're planning something. Be careful. Anonymous. The next day, my drone was gone. I'd left it charging in the garage, where I always kept it. And when I returned from the hardware store, the charger was still there, but the drone and its controller were missing. No sign of forced entry, just gone. I knew it was them. But they didn't know I had backups. They didn't know I'd recorded the entire HOA meeting with a GoPro in my shirt pocket. They didn't know Dana had already scheduled an article to publish on Monday. And they definitely didn't know that I had quietly installed a second drone, smaller, quieter, and equipped with night vision on the roof. Later that evening, while reviewing motion footage from the side of the garage, I saw them, two figures, one of whom I recognized from the board, slipping through my side gate in the dead of night. One carried a backpack. I zoomed in. In the grainy footage, I could just make out a sticker on the backpack, Sycamore Glen HOA, Volunteer Cleanup Crew. Cleanup indeed. I packaged the video, the HOA's phony meeting proposal, and the theft report, and sent them all in a digital dossier to the same city investigator I'd been in contact with. Subject line. They escalated. 24 hours later, I received a reply. Escalation confirmed. Temporary injunction being drafted. Do not engage. We will be contacting you shortly for deposition. They wanted to silence me. Instead, they gave me everything I needed. The knock came at 8:03 a.m. sharp the next day. I opened the door, expecting another HOA courier or a petty citation pinned to my siding. Instead, I found a woman in a slate gray suit holding a city ID and a leather-bound portfolio. She introduced herself as Evelyn Park, Assistant Investigator from the Office of Municipal Governance and Compliance. Her handshake was firm, her eyes alert. May we speak inside? Behind her stood two more officials, one from zoning and the other from the HOA Oversight Task Force. They weren't there for coffee. We sat around my dining table, which until then had been mostly covered with garden magazines and old grocery flyers. I cleared it quickly and brought out my organized folders, flash drives, the drone's replacement, and most importantly, the letter I'd received warning me to be careful. We've reviewed your footage, Evelyn began. The secret event you captured violates city zoning laws, fire ordinances, and several financial disclosure mandates under your HOA charter. The man from zoning, a tall balding fellow named Roger, added, and if what you say about the catering company is true, and the invoices match the board members' family interests, this may extend into criminal misappropriation. I leaned back slightly, folding my arms. They've been doing this for years. I'm just the first one who didn't blink. Evelyn tapped her pen. Well, it's about time someone made them. I provided a complete walkthrough from the drone flights to the meetings, the threats, the break-in, and the disappearance of my equipment. I even played them the garage camera footage, slow, grainy, but unmistakable. Roger confirmed the identity of one of the men as a board appointee named Dean Wexler. He'd been implicated in another community years ago, but the case had disappeared in arbitration. That won't happen this time, Evelyn said. Especially not with the exposure your journalist friend is preparing. Speaking of, I said walking them to the door when we were done. Dana's story goes live Monday. It's already scheduled. Unless I tell her to delay it, it'll hit all major platforms by noon. Don't delay it, Evelyn said. That kind of pressure may actually speed up compliance. And protection. Protection. That word stayed with me. I wasn't paranoid, but I wasn't stupid either. The previous night's intrusion proved they weren't above coming onto my property, sneaking through shadows to grab whatever they thought would silence me. But what they hadn't realized was that I'd already stopped fighting alone. That evening, Dana called. I'm getting swamped with calls, she said. Other residents from your neighborhood. A few from different subdivisions. They're sharing similar stories. Harassment, secret spending threats. You lit a match. Good, I said. Let it burn. But even as I said it, I felt the tension building. They were going to push harder before this was over. That's what people like Karen do. Those who build paper kingdoms with fake titles and cheap authority. They hold on until the very last page turns. Sure enough, the next day, another envelope arrived. This one was typed, sealed with the HOA logo in thick blue ink. Inside, notice of community board hearing. Your continued behavior is deemed destructive, slanderous, and malicious. You are hereby summoned to a disciplinary review with the HOA Executive Board. Attendance is mandatory under Section 3.24 of the Community Charter. Non-attendance will be considered admission of guilt. Hearing to be held Thursday at 6:00 p.m. at the clubhouse. No date of formal charges. No listed violations. Just threats dressed in bureaucracy. I smiled. This was the trap. They wanted to frame the narrative stage a kangaroo court to turn public perception against me. But I had no intention of playing defense anymore. That evening, I called Dana again. Change of plan, I told her. I want you there. Bring a camera. I thought you'd never ask. Thursday arrived. The sun dipped low by the time I walked toward the clubhouse, dressed not in anything special, but in a navy blue shirt that bore the emblem of my old division. A silent reminder to them and to me that I had weathered worse storms. Dana was already there, seated near the back, her camera positioned discreetly on a tripod lens, focused on the board table. The room was packed again. The tension was different this time, thicker, heavier. People weren't whispering. They were watching. Karen sat at the center, flanked by Marty and Cheryl and two new committee advisors I hadn't seen before. They looked nervous. Karen didn't. She opened with a forced smile. Mr. Granger, thank you for agreeing to this forum. We're here to resolve misunderstandings and protect our community from harmful behavior. I remained standing. Then let's talk about your unauthorized party. The misused funds, the fake invoices, the threats. Her jaw tensed. This isn't the place for accusations. It's exactly the place. I turned to the room. My name is Thomas Granger. I served 22 years in the United States Army. I moved here looking for peace. What I found was a board more concerned with power than people. They fined me for flying a drone within my own airspace. Then they tried to hide a private party held with HOA money. They called the police. They broke into my garage. And now they want to put me on trial. The murmurs returned, louder this time. I stepped back and gestured toward Dana's camera. This is being recorded. Every minute. And the city investigator assigned to this case will receive the full transcript. Karen stood, voice rising. This meeting is not authorized for media. Dana leaned forward. You posted flyers in a public space, opened the event to all members, and did not include a media restriction. You're on the record, Ms. Mendel. Panic flickered across Karen's face. I walked to the center of the room and dropped a manila envelope on the table. Inside copies of every fine, every threat, every image, and a fresh printout of the HOA's secret event. This one annotated with budget line items and supplier records pulled from public filings. This is who you're dealing with, I said to the crowd. Not a troublemaker. A neighbor. A veteran. A homeowner with every right to fly a drone and expect integrity from those who represent us. Karen sat down hard. The room erupted, voices rising, people demanding explanations. I stepped back and let them speak. For the first time, they weren't whispering. They were waking up. The article dropped Monday morning at 9:02 a.m. It was titled, "Drone Footage Uncovers HOA Corruption in Suburban Community." And it didn't pull any punches. Dana had done her homework. Every accusation was backed by footage, documents, and statements from current and former residents who had quietly endured the board's abuses for years. By 10:30 a.m., my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I ignored most of the calls. I didn't need to hear more than I already knew, that the quiet image Sycamore Glen had built for itself was crumbling fast, and Karen Mendel's name was at the center of it. The article had gone viral beyond our neighborhood. HOA abuse wasn't a new story, but it was rarely documented this thoroughly. And certainly not with high-definition drone footage of board members drinking wine under strung lights while charging residents for unauthorized parties. By noon, local reporters were knocking on doors. By 2 p.m., a television news van was parked 2 blocks from my home. And by 5 p.m., the HOA website had gone offline. The fallout was fast. City investigators released an interim statement confirming they had launched a full audit of Sycamore Glen HOA's finances and zoning compliance. A temporary freeze was placed on all HOA spending and fines. An emergency town hall was scheduled not by the HOA, but by the city council. The clubhouse, once a symbol of tightly controlled decorum, became a gathering spot for angry neighbors. That night, I attended the town hall. It was standing room only. Residents who had once looked away now stood with their arms crossed and their questions ready. A retired teacher named Eleanor spoke first, tears in her eyes, as she described the time Karen fined her $200 for non-conforming flower pots. A father of 3 shared how he'd been denied permission to build a backyard swing set, only to find out that a board member's grandson had one approved as an exception. Story after story, voice after voice. Then someone asked the question everyone was thinking. Why didn't we speak up sooner? There was a pause. Then Eleanor, the teacher, answered softly, because we thought we were alone. That silence cracked something open. More neighbors stepped forward. People apologized to each other for not believing, for staying silent, for assuming the worst of the wrong people. And just like that, the real community started to form, not in HOA handbooks or board meetings, but in the honest voices of people who finally felt safe enough to speak. Karen didn't attend. Neither did Marty or Cheryl. They were likely already consulting attorneys or hiding behind statements drafted by whatever HOA legal firm had been charging them by the hour. But their absence only confirmed what everyone already suspected: the emperor had no clothes. And we had the footage to prove it. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on my porch when a soft knock came at my gate. I looked up to find an older man I recognized, but had never formally met. His name was Glenn Morales, Vietnam vet, lived 2 streets over, and had once been on the HOA board years before Karen took over. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I nodded and poured him a cup. He took a long sip, then looked out across the street. "I saw the article," he said. "Damn brave thing you did." I shrugged, felt more like survival. He smiled. "You know, I used to fly those big birds back in the day, Hueys mostly. Never thought I'd see the day someone brought down a board with a drone." I laughed. Times change. His smile faded a little. "They pushed me out too," he said. "Not as loud as what they did to you, but subtle. Little things. They made my life hell when I tried to call out some shady landscaping contracts. I figured no one would care." He looked at me again, this time with something like gratitude. "But you made 'em care." It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that in recent days. A woman from across the street dropped off a pie and an apology she'd voted for Karen twice. A teenage boy who used to skate near the clubhouse brought over a homemade sign that read, "Free airspace forever." Kids drew drones in chalk on the sidewalk near my driveway. Someone even left a bottle of scotch with a note, "For when you write the book." But the most surprising gesture came from Eleanor. She showed up on my doorstep 3 days after the town hall, holding a manila folder and wearing a determined expression. "I found this in a box from the last HOA transition," she said. "Figured you might know what to do with it." Inside were bank statements, handwritten notes, old correspondence between Karen and a former board president, one who had mysteriously resigned mid-term. The dates lined up with some of the earliest complaints Dana had uncovered. It was the beginning of the rot, and Eleanor had unknowingly held on to the spark that started it all. I thanked her, then scanned and sent the documents straight to the municipal investigator. By the end of the week, it was official Karen Mendel was being placed under formal investigation for financial misconduct, violation of public trust, and obstruction of a zoning inquiry. The HOA board was dissolved by city order. A temporary council of homeowners was appointed to transition the community back into compliance with elections to follow. For the first time in years, there would be oversight, transparency, balance, and Sycamore Glen would begin to breathe again. That Sunday, I took my drone up one more time. Not to investigate, not to expose, just to watch the neighborhood from above. Kids played in driveways. A man walked his dog past my house and waved. Someone was putting up a birdhouse. A group of neighbors were gathered around a grill in a front yard, no permits, no fines, just community. I hovered the drone above it all, the sun warm on my back, the wind steady in my ears. This was what I'd moved here for. And finally, it felt like home. The unraveling of Karen Mendel was not a dramatic explosion. It was a slow, pitiful collapse. By the time the city's official investigation made the evening news, she'd already locked down her social media, disconnected her home phone, and refused to answer the door. Word had it she'd taken a leave of absence from her job at a local insurance firm. Rumors swirled that the firm was reconsidering her employment altogether, once Dana's article was picked up by regional outlets. But true to form, Karen couldn't stay quiet for long. The confrontation happened 3 days after the article broke at the town's weekend farmers market of all places. I was browsing a stand of heirloom tomatoes when I felt her presence before I even turned. The air around her was colder somehow, denser. "You think you're some kind of hero?" she hissed from behind me. I turned slowly, careful not to flinch or react. She looked worse than I remembered, tight lines around her mouth, dark circles under her eyes. Her usual pastel perfection traded in for a frumpy windbreaker and clenched fists. "I didn't see you at the last community meeting," I said calmly. "Big turnout. You'd have loved it." Her eyes flared. "You've ruined everything," she spat. "My name, my job, my family is getting threats. I've had to install cameras because of you." I raised an eyebrow. Funny, I seem to recall someone telling me drones were invasive. She stepped closer, too close. "You were a nobody," she growled. "A pathetic, lonely old man who flew a toy around like a child. And now you've poisoned everything. For what revenge?" "No," I said, voice level. "For truth." Karen scoffed. "You think you've won something? This place will go to hell without us. People like you don't know how to lead. You know how to stir chaos. That's all." A few shoppers nearby had stopped what they were doing. A woman was filming discreetly with her phone. I took a breath. "Karen, what I did wasn't about power. It was about fairness. You thought you could control people by using fear and paperwork. But real communities aren't built on control. They're built on trust. And you lost that the moment you stopped listening." Her face twisted. "You're going to regret this." I smiled. "I don't think I will." She left in a huff, pushing past a vendor's stand and knocking over a basket of peaches. She didn't even stop to pick them up. The video of the exchange made the rounds by evening. Someone added music to it, an overly dramatic soundtrack, turning her rant into a meme. Another dubbed in the phrase, "You were a nobody," with auto-tune. Within a day, it was trending under the hashtag #DroneDadVs I didn't ask for the spotlight, but I wasn't ashamed of it either. If it meant other neighborhoods would think twice about allowing unchecked HOA control, then so be it. And while Karen flailed in the mud, she'd stirred something else was happening. The community was beginning to heal. A week later, I was invited to a neighborhood barbecue, the first officially recognized event under the new temporary HOA council. It was held right on the greenbelt behind the clubhouse, the same place Karen had hosted her secret party. But this time there were no gates, no wristbands, no cash box hidden under a table. Just people. Kids with chalk dogs on leashes, a jazz band someone's cousin volunteered to play in. People brought potluck dishes from all over the world. Biryani lasagna, pulled pork, and a few casseroles of questionable origin. But the spirit was unmistakable. Warm, unforced. I was standing near the grill with Glenn Morales when Cheryl, the old treasurer, walked over. She looked sheepish. "I wanted to say something," she said. Glenn gave me a quick nod and wandered off to refill his lemonade. I turned to Cheryl, arms crossed. "Go on." "I knew things weren't right," she said, staring at her shoes. "Karen didn't let us see full financials. Said she'd handle everything directly with vendors. I didn't ask questions. Why not? Her voice cracked. Because I didn't want to be pushed out like the last treasurer. I studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You still had a responsibility. I know, she said, her eyes wet. I'm sorry. I nodded again, slower this time. Help fix it. She looked up. I want to. And in that moment, I realized that even the complicit weren't always malicious. Some were just afraid. Conditioned to obey, to survive quietly. But not anymore. The temporary council set election dates. New bylaws were drafted with actual legal consultation this time, and residents were given the power to approve them line by line. A transparency portal was launched online. Budgets, minutes, voting records, all public. One afternoon, Dana visited again this time, not to report, but to thank me. She brought a signed copy of her magazine's print edition with our story on the cover. You know, she said, sipping coffee in my kitchen, there's a dozen communities asking me for interviews now. They want to know how you did it. I smirked. Tell them I just pressed record. She laughed. You didn't just press record, you gave people permission to look up, to question. That's not nothing. When she left, I placed the magazine on my bookshelf next to my wife's gardening journals and a framed photo of my daughter in uniform, saluting at her boot camp graduation. For the first time in years, I felt full, settled, free. Fall arrived quietly in Sycamore Glen. The leaves blushed orange and gold, the air grew crisp, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt light. You could hear it in the voices of children playing in yards that had once been silent. You could see it in the way neighbors greeted each other at the mailbox, no longer with suspicious glances, but with nods, smiles, even the occasional invitation to lunch. The shadow that Karen Mendel had cast for so long was gone, replaced not by another dictator in a pastel sweater, but by an actual board of elected volunteers. People who lived here raised families, here and now had a reason to protect it, not hoard it. I had decided not to run for the board. Several people asked, some insisted, but I told them the truth. I wasn't looking to lead. I just wanted to live. Still, I agreed to sit on a transparency committee, one that reviewed policy proposals and ensured residents had access to information before any vote. We met once a month, sometimes over coffee at my kitchen table, sometimes under the big elm tree in Eleanor's backyard. The meetings were relaxed, honest. No clipboards, no hidden agendas. Karen was formally charged 2 weeks after the audit concluded. Misuse of HOA funds, obstruction of community records, and 2 counts of criminal trespass related to the footage of her minions entering my property. She took a plea deal to avoid jail time, community service, a hefty fine, and a 5-year ban from serving on any HOA board in the state. I didn't go to the sentencing. I didn't need to. Justice didn't look like her behind bars. It looked like her absence. It looked like a neighborhood blooming again, uncoiled from fear. One morning in early October, I woke up to the sound of laughter outside. I looked out the window and saw a small crowd gathered on my front lawn. At first, I thought something was wrong, but then I recognized the faces, neighbors' kids, Glenn, Eleanor, even Cheryl. They had come bearing gifts. Someone had baked muffins. Another had brought a framed drone photo. I'd taken the one that showed the whole neighborhood from above, sun streaming through autumn leaves. In the center of it all, in sharp clarity, was the clubhouse, no longer a monument to control, but a symbol of new beginnings. Eleanor stepped forward and handed me an envelope. Inside was a certificate, hand-lettered, simple. To Thomas Granger, for giving us back our voice. I stood there for a moment, stunned, then cleared my throat. I didn't do this alone, I said. You all stood up. I just flew a camera. Glenn chuckled. You flew a flag, Tom. We just followed it. Later that afternoon, I set up my folding chair in the backyard, the way I always did, and launched the drone again. It lifted into the sky with that familiar hum, quiet but purposeful, gliding upward as the neighborhood grew smaller beneath it. I steered it gently, passing over rooftops and backyards through patches of red and yellow leaves until I reached the clearing where Karen's secret party had once taken place. Now there were children running in circles, chalk drawings on the sidewalk, and a community garden being planted in what had once been guarded space. There was no gate, no one taking payments, no clipboard, just people, together. I hovered the drone there, soaking it in, then tilted the camera toward the horizon. Freedom looked like this. Perspective. Truth. A reminder that even the quietest resistance can shake something loose. I brought the drone back, slowly landing it in the grass beside me. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had nowhere else to be. I closed my eyes. No wars to fight, no secrets to uncover. Just the steady breath of peace, and the endless open sky above.